I'm Sandra Timpson Motto. I'm Vice Chair of the Center for Architecture, Sarasota. And today we have Richard Geary, known as Dick to many of his friends, who's here to talk to us about a very special project that he did concerning Paul Rudolph and the Paul Rudolph apartment that existed for some years on Beekman Place in New York City. So please meet Richard Geary.
Howdy.
Dick, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you managed to get yourself inside the apartment and actually do an entire documentation of the furniture in the apartment.
Well, I'm admittedly an architecture junkie, and I saw an article in Nest magazine in the spring of about '99, and I called the editor of the magazine up because I'd seen these pictures of this apartment many times, and I really said I really need to see this because it said that Paul Rudolph had died and the apartment was for sale.
And this was in what year?
This is about '99, and I called him up and I said, can you give me any kind of contact for me to get in this place and take a look at it before it's gone? And he said, sure, I'd be happy to. And he gave me the name of Ernst Wagner, who lived in the apartment, was still living in the apartment. And I called Ernst on the phone and I said, is there any way I can come and look at this place? And he said, sure, by all means. And I came up with my wife and my daughter and we took a walk through, and I said, what's going to happen to this? And he said, well, it's been willed to the Library of Congress, and the Library of Congress is going to sell it. And so in essence it'll be gone fairly soon. And I said, has anybody documented this beyond the glamour shots of photography that I've seen in various magazines? And he said, well, no, not really. And I said, would you mind if I came with a photographer? I'll bring him up from Florida and document this place before it's gone. And he said, by all means. So we had this wonderful relationship that began, and a few weeks later I came up with a photographer, and the two of us spent 3 days in the apartment. And Ernst basically just handed us the keys. And we lit fires in the fireplace, and we were there when the sun came up in the morning, and we were there when the sun went down in the evening, and we shot every inch because we knew that it was likely going to disappear in its existing condition. And ultimately that's the story. I came back and we processed the film, and I was in touch with Ernst, who was the executor of the estate at that time, and I said, Ernst, I'd like to give you these photographs for the Paul Rudolph Foundation to do with what you will, because at the time I gave talks to various other architectural groups to see if we could send enough letters to the Library of Congress to see if we could make a foundation. Ultimately that didn't happen, but a collector of modern furniture bought the apartment and began to strip the apartment of all of its transparency and reflectivity, which is really what the place was about in the first place.
Did he buy it with the furniture in it, or was the furniture taken out?
Well, what you have to understand about the furniture is, with Paul, furniture was part of the architecture. So there was a great deal of it that was built in. There were only a few mobile pieces of furniture in the unit, one of which will be displayed here at the Center for Architecture. It's come down from New York by Ernst's generosity for us to see, and everything was just kind of left, and the personal items in the library and everything were taken out.
Oh, so. And they're with the Paul Rudolph Foundation now?
They're with the Paul Rudolph Heritage Foundation now.
Excellent. Good. So when you got in there, obviously you started to think about Paul Rudolph's life and his creativity, and did it give you a sense that you got to know the man a little bit? And I'd love to hear.
Well, I think the thing that I found most fascinating about it was the fact that this was a really intellectual space. It was a space that was way beyond the decorative, and it really was about transparency. It was about light. It was about the industrial forms that Paul Rudolph liked to use so much. But it was really kind of an interesting intellectual exercise, which can only be done with the time or the funds or both of someone who's really interested in exploring space and exploring light and its manipulation. And so I was fascinated by this as an interior designer because I wanted to know how he did it. And for me, it was a great excuse to be able to spend time with the space and to begin to really understand it, because it's incredibly complicated. Because in some places you can see the space from 4 stories all the way down. And in some places the ceilings are reflective, so you can see the space reflected, so it continues to even go further. So in any case, for me it was a dream come true to be able to explore a space like that.
Why don't you explain the drawings behind you? Those are the 4 stories of the Rudolph Beekman Place apartment, yes?
Well, when he rented an apartment on the 4th floor. This is a pre-war building. It's almost kind of Victorian in nature from the street. And the main facade, the original facade on the East River, is on a very small street that's sandwiched between 49th Street and 51st, just north of the UN. And he rented an apartment on the 4th floor and had it for many years even while he was still teaching at Yale.
What year would that be that he moved in here?
Well, I'm thinking he moved in in the apartment about 1961. He was still the chairman of architecture at Yale until about 1966 when he left. And then he opened up his own practice in Manhattan. And he had other offices at that point in time, but then later on in the early 70s, when New York real estate hit a real downturn because of the oil crisis, in '72 he had the opportunity to buy the building. And so he bought the entire building. And so the first 6 floors of it were rented out into other small apartments. And he decided to add on to the upper portion of the building and have it overlook the river.
Well, he was an architect after all. So
After all.
Of course he had to make his mark on the building, right?
And I had the extraordinary experience in trying to research this, being in a bookstore in the Upper East Side of New York, asking the proprietress if she knew where I could find books on Paul Rudolph, and she said, well, there are very, very few. And the gentleman who was the only other person in the store standing next to me said, why are you interested? And that became a very long friendship, because he was the guy who actually worked for Paul and helped Paul build the apartment. So I got the backstory on how all of this was put together and how he fought with the building department and how he manipulated the city into allowing him to build this extension of this building out over the river and out over the sidewalks and out over the scope of the building based on his knowledge of building codes.
Amazing.
And it became a very, very fascinating part of the story for me.
Absolutely. There's a chair in this exhibit here at the Center for Architecture this weekend, and you can see through it. Can you talk about that chair?
Well, the disassembly of furniture really began with Rietveld back in about 1918. And Rietveld, for me, from the Distill movement, was probably one of the most revolutionary guys, because, you know, all furniture was overstuffed and was very formal and was using all of the symbols of wealth and power, the hand carving and everything at that period of time. And he actually created a chair that was very skeletal, and it was because of his background as a cabinet maker before he became an architect that he could experiment with these methods of joinery.
Tell me his name again.
Gerrit Rietveld.
Rietveld.
And this chair is really built on those same principles of abstraction. And what Paul used was a system that was a display system called Abstracta. And so all the tubes and the connectors of this were from this Abstracta system. And he just arranged them in such a way that they would support a person, and then he used the same plexiglass planes instead of solid and very much on the same, from the same concept from Rietveld, except that it was transparent, which went with his entire idea about transparency and light.
You have a maquette behind you that I would love to hear the story about.
Well, the maquette, I asked Ernst about it, and I said, tell me about this. And he said, well, at one point in time, Paul had entertained the idea of creating a building for the University of Florida. And there was some conversation about entering a competition for that. And also, Paul thought that perhaps he could enlist Picasso to create a sculpture, or that there would be a sculptural maquette that was already in existence that might be applicable.
Did he already know Picasso?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question exactly. I know that he ultimately knew him, but whether he just reached out to him or not, there's so little written that I can't really answer the question. All I know is that once the project fell through, Rudolph asked Picasso if he could make a copy of the maquette before he sent it back. And apparently Picasso gave permission for this. And Paul made not one, but 5. Okay, and one always sat in the apartment. And I only discovered later that there were several others that were still in the foundation. And they were gracious enough to give me one of these when I gave them all the photographs from the photo shoot. And I've had this in my house ever since. So it's kind of a Picasso twice removed.
Well, it certainly looks like Picasso, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.